Right, okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm going to try this literally. I was originally intending to start this literally 30 minutes ago, but then you know when you get like problems with OBS and literally absolutely nothing works, and Crunchyroll is playing games that I don't have I really don't have time to start playing with. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we move on to the second part of Christian Weston Chandler as far as his comics are concerned. But first, today's date, the 6th of December 2023. Disclaimer: do not buy or buy anything from Chris. He lies about needing money and habitually neglects his customers and supporters, and worse. It has been 41 days since Chris last begged for money. The original record streak was roughly 881 days. It has been 105 days since Chris last uploaded pages to meet his formerly paid obligations to the Sonichu Comics, and the record streak is 1,525 days, and it has also been 5,185 days since Chris last applied for a job. That record is yet to be broken. That's quite something. So now we move on, ladies and gentlemen, to the character of Christian Weston Chandler in comic form. So, first of all, is that this is what you need to know as... This is what Chris, for the most part, sees himself looking as. And when I was, like, in limbo a little bit about exactly what I wanted to do for this video, there was also many other different things I wanted to do aside. From theoretically wanting to talk about why Chris's characters do not work, and why Chris's ideas of characters, of narrative, of suspension, drama, comedy, why all of these things don't work. But that's going to be... And again, this is just from the mouth of a professional speaking here, so we're just going to see how well that holds up. So bear that in mind, because it's about as rustic as you can get, and I don't even know how... Chris's coup de crayon is holding up that giant peach of a head of his. So, anyway. Christian Weston Chandler is a character and technically the main protagonist of the Sonichu comic series. Within the comic universe, Chris has not opted to portray himself as a fat slob who refuses to work, unlike his real-life counterpart. Rather, he is the respected creator of Quickville, father of hero Sonichu, and a defiant character beloved by all. Despite the sub-episodes in which he appears ostensibly concerning the real Chris, he can't seem to keep from invoking superpowers and fictitious plot contrivances, because there can never be a single instance in the comics where Chris could ever lose. In December of 2014, it was revealed that, just like his real-life counterpart, Comic Chris has become transgender, and goes by the name Christine Weston Chandler. And as we can see here, this is what Chris looks like as of, since 2014 as far as the comics are concerned. So whether or not you want to say Chris has morphed into a giraffe is entirely down to you, but if you want to say otherwise, you're more than free to do so. You just need to change this one bit. So basically, here's just everything you need to know. In the comics, Chris depicted himself as mayor, only stopping us off as far as February of 2017, when the new mayor mentioned of his fictitious town Quickville. Unlike real life, Comic Chris is popular, good-looking, notionally speaking, and surrounded by adoring women whose real-life counterparts are genuinely trolls, gal pals who hate him, or fictitious creations like Alice and Amber. He also has the ability to change himself into Chris Chan Sonichu and use any of all the powers of the Electric Hedgehog Pokemon at will, thus rendering Sonichu and company completely superfluous. You're not wrong. It's literally all about what Chris can do, and that's his entire character, apparently. His entire character is literally to win, no matter how stupid it may come across. Any characteristics Comic Chris possesses stem from Chris's attempts to portray himself as a lovable loser type of character, known from any generic romantic comedy. He is portrayed as noble, brave, intelligent, and surrounded by cartoon characters who fawn over him. Considering what Chris is like in real life, it's the only people that would fancy him are the ones that are completely fictitious. Even then. However, so as not to appear to be a complete Mary Sue, Comic Chris also has trouble with finding a girlfriend, is shown to have a limited ability to fight off his enemies, and is regularly in need of help from his supportive friends in order to overcome his problems. In the comic, real-life relics like his medallion are not mere paraphernalia, they're magical items, which can make his dreams come true. And I hope you're liking this little slideshow of every time Chris has drawn himself in the comics, because, well, each one is somehow worse and less consistent than an episode of Ren and Stimpy. You know, which, ironically, giving the contrast to John K. Faluski, that might not be too disaccurate as far as crimes are concerned between him and Chris. Anyways. Quickville completes with a dotting secretary, now heiress to the Quickville legacy, on whom he dumps all his dirty work, which she takes with a smile. However, his actual role relative to the citizens of his city is closer to God King than mere creator. His office was permanent and indisputable during his time in it, and every character reserves him as their creator and supreme being, and is unswervingly loyal to him, for no reason. If it weren't totally obvious, Chris's comic persona is a pure wish fulfillment Mary Sue, because Chris has trouble finding the line between reality and fiction. Added with his compulsive knack to cling onto anything that would justify him as a person, Chris tends to view his achievements in the comic as genuine achievements, and held the title of Mayor of Quickville when addressing himself. Sonichu is the main character of his self-titled comic in name only, while all the Electric Hedgehog Pokemon tend to make up an ensemble cast with equal weight on the story. If there is any true lead protagonist to the series, then it is Chris. The comic's narrative focuses on him and the problems he has to deal with, and virtually everything in the world of Quickville only seems to matter in relation to Chris, much like the real world, towards the end of the initial run of Sonichu. Chris began to feel that the focus of his trolls and personal problems were distracting the series from its original purpose, and created Sonichu issue 10 to wrap up his storylines in the most gruesome, violent, but satisfying way possible, supposedly to let his character retire in a blaze of glory. Technically that didn't happen, but we'll get to that in a second. Speaking of things I actually want to get to, I've never seen this before. The quick anatomy. So, we see from top to bottom, nothing of interest, underdeveloped muscles, masturbating hand, heart 40% shattered, another masturbation hand, a man boob, biting emptiness of a life wasted, basically where either his stomach, his spleen, or his kidney is supposed to be, a pasty unwashed skin, which we kind of know this, a loose anus, his bent pickle, a non-autistic fetal twin absorbed into Chris at 3 months old, a masturbation foot, and a clubbed foot. So, yeah, that's like a very gruesome, but not necessarily the worst sort of metaphor, you could say, because it literally features like a rotting corpse vertical. That's basically what they're getting across with that one. Prior to appearing in Sonichu issue 11, Chris updated his in-comic incarnation to reflect his transgenderism in 2014, with the resulting design looking even less like his real-life self than he did before transitioning. He draws himself as a complete female, with a feminine shape relative to the featureless rectangles he generally uses for his bodies, that is, his breasts and his hair. Greasy, thin, and receding in real life is full and feminine. As in customary, his heterochromia is hugely exaggerated, and he is intended to look attractive. That being said, he still drew himself fucking Sonichu in the ass with his duck at the request of the idea guys, ostensibly to ensure that God-bear-given daughter comes into this world. So at best, this iteration of the character is intersex. Whether Chris likes to believe it or not, but unfortunately, because Well, a typical comic depiction of Chris, a tall, broad-shouldered, handsome young man, compared to the real hunched, fatty, double-chinned Chris we all know and run away from. Atrocities. See also list of unheroic protagonist actions. Predictably, Chris's creation of a world in which he is God results in even more insane behavior than is exhibited his real-life counterpart, primarily due to him and his super-powered goons possessing the power to actually carry out his threats in a controlled environment where he can attempt to, that is, portray himself as morally superior. In only 11 issues, including 4 specials, he permanently crippled someone by shooting him in the legs after he'd surrendered, completely destroyed the life of a man who was simply doing his job, and then callously mocking him by saying that he'd suffer worse, destroyed a populated building which he had sealed up beforehand to ensure no living thing escaped, and later trying to blame it on the building's lackluster security, broke into an old woman's home and brutally attacked her to the extent of causing permanent paralysis, directly ordering the murder of over 1,500 people in the self-perpetuated destruction of the 4-cent Garbage.com building, orchestrated a purging of homosexuals and asexuals, and arranged a show trial for 4 men in an openly biased court. I believe the correct term is kangaroo court, but what can you do? Before personally executing them in brutal and inhumane ways, forcing children to commit first-degree murder in the process for the crime of making a parody webcomic. It should be noted that Chris's avatar undertakes all of these actions with self-righteous euphoria and offers no justification, nor does he display any remorse. Because Chris is a psychopath. That's what we're calling that. He is a psychopath, which again is the blending of a psychopath and a sociopath. The one in which Chris believes that society governs him to do terrible deeds because there's somehow in his eyes righteousness, and psychotic because his actions, even from the view of sociopathists, would be deemed criminally insane. So it's basically Chris is God, and because he was God, basically everyone suffered. And we're sort of going to go through just the list of every single crime. So bear this in mind, because Chris does write himself to be the main character and the one we're supposed to root for despite all of these. So let's start from the beginning. Right from Sonichu issue 0, Chris is depicted on the front cover commanding Sonichu to zap to the extreme, and within the comic itself congratulating Sonichu for his victory. At this point, Chris is drawing himself only semi-realistically, but he is still a minor character. Sonichu issue 0 is one of the rare issues that is actually based primarily around the idea of Sonichu as the protagonist. Sonichu issue 1 is perhaps Chris's lowest key outing in the entire comic, merely depicting himself commenting on the actions of the characters and, bizarrely, his own drawing ability. Issue 2. Having again drawn himself on the cover by Sonichu issue 2, Chris has turned himself into a fully fledged main character, with no fanfare whatsoever or any lead or build, because again, this should have been about Sonichu, but whoop-de-doo. Chris depicts himself as the messiah of the ancient prophecy foretold by his ancestors. It is in this issue that he first gains his ability to turn into Chris Chan Sonichu, an event which will dominate the rest of the series to the point of Sonichu's redundancy. Issue 3. After being featured in the previous comic, Chris takes a back seat in order to put a spotlight on the chaotic combo. Sadly, he still can't resist adding his head onto the first page. Issue 4. Now this is where things get strange. The legendary comic made entirely up of sub-episodes about Chris's life. Things get a little confusing because not only are the Electric Hedgehog Pokemon depicted as existing in real Chris's universe, but he also has superpowers with which to battle the Jerk Cops. Again, Chris is depicting himself with selfless friends and powers he wish he actually had, but doesn't. And all the powers and Pokemon in the world still don't stop him getting beaten up by Jerk Cops or being trolled by Hannah. This comic also marks the introduction of Crystal, his imagined sister, on whose beauty he remarks numerous times. Despite the fact, again, this is meant to be his sister, but You know what? Again, this is the sort of thing that died away. But what came from this is probably even worse. Sonichu issue 5. Real Chris, distraught at discovering Sarah Nicole Hammer, a long-standing love interest of his, is getting married, depicts himself as a noble gentleman who only wants what's best for her. Of course, in reality, Sarah couldn't have cared less what Chris thought of the wedding, but Chris felt that showing his acceptance was vitally important. An interpretation could be made that Chris is battling the two versions of himself, the side who wants Sarah all to himself, real Chris played by Wes Isley, and the side who wants Sarah to be happy, comic Chris. It probably helped that by this point, Chris had transferred his feelings from Sarah over to Megan, who makes her debut appearance as Sailor Megtoon, allowing him to make the noble choice a lot easier than it would have been otherwise. This comic also introduces the pseudo-manga art style. Thanks a lot, Megan. Why? Okay, there's no need to do her dirty like that. That would come to characterize later comics. While the art doesn't get better, it at least becomes comparatively more consistent than it did previously. By the next episode, things start to get confusing. Yes, Chris is Mayor of Quickville and can order around public servants, but he still can't find a girlfriend. Despite this, he continues to depict himself as a noble warrior of love, protecting all of Virginia from those who would attempt to take it away. Sonichu issue 6 is the first issue to go into detail about how Comic Chris manages to run a city, while sitting around getting trolled. Opening with real-life Chris discovering that his beloved dog Paddy Chandler can talk, the action soon switches to Comic Chris as they enter Quickville. Chris introduces Paddy Chan to Allison Amber, a Hollywood starlet who inexplicably gave up her promising career to run Quickville. I don't understand that either. While Chris was sitting in his attraction locations. The character is indicative of how Chris portrays himself as charismatic that young women will drop everything to do his bidding. He is Le Big Cheese. Either way, fictional Allison Amber has a boyfriend, so Chris loses in his own comic yet again. Comic Chris spends the rest of the comic bemoaning his loneliness and making bizarre and scarcely comprehensible hints that Megan is his true sweetheart. Even in comic form, Megan wants none of this, as will be explained very, very quickly. Sonichu issue 7. That's like one of the worst ways. Outside of the straw of truth, that might be the worst way. Chris, his head looks like a potato on a little stick. The megalomania begins on the cover, which is decorated with tiny pictures of the important moments of Chris's life, such as the time he held a basketball or tricked Megan into being photographed with him. The comic itself revolves around Comic Chris and Megan, who is depicted as struggling with her feelings for Chris. In reality, at this point, she hated him. The comic at this point was being used as a tool to attract Megan. So much of the extraneous action is centered on the dating life of the Sonichus as a barely veiled hint as to what direction their friendship should take. The courting of Megan is also why it's the most manga-esque issue to date, which in turn results in Chris's self-depictions being hugely inconsistent in style, which is like one of the things you should probably never try to do. Also, by the way, this is Comic Chris in 2014 showing off a Tongo look. I guess. Wait, which one? Hang on, which one is this? Is it meant to be? Is this meant to be Robbie Sonny, or is this meant to be Chris? Because I'm not too sure which is meant to be which. I don't really know what anything in this panel is meant to look like, but I'll take his word for it. The courting of Megan is also why it's the most... Okay, here we go. The issue is also notorious for its introduction of Sammy, intended to be a bumbling Peter Griffin-type counterpart to Comic Chris. Sammy is extremely stupid, massively overweight, and shits his pants, which results in a far greater resemblance to the real Chris than Comic Chris has ever had. Halfway through making this comic, Chris was being trolled relentlessly, so he responded by trapping himself in the time void, and thus removing himself from the direct action in the comic, a measure that would not last very long. Issue number 8. Unable to keep himself completely out of the action, Chris somehow emerges temporarily from the time void on the 10th floor in the 4-cent Garbage.com building in order to physically assault an employee who is working on a caricature of the oversized drinking straw picture. And if you do not know what that is, yeah, here it is. It's, well, the original is about as stupid as you can physically get, and physically too, it's also quite improbable, and even when it's edited, it doesn't particularly look that much better either. Did Chris even at one point possibly consider how bad this looked? Probably didn't, but you get the idea. While Rosechew and Sonichu cheer him on in unison, Chris disappears immediately afterwards. Issue 9. Even though Chris remains trapped in the time void, he can't resist including himself substantially in this issue. The first time he shows up is during Ivy's vision, portraying her being with Chris as told by God and Jesus. The second time is at the end of the comic. In that scene, Magi-chan and Wild Sonichu discover the time void and end up pulling Chris out of it. 15 minutes later, Chris as Chris-chan Sonichu unveils some sort of plan which isn't elaborated, and he races off. On the final page, Chris declares that he and anyone he created out of his sweetheart Serge misadventures will never show up in the pages of his comic again, though the last page presumes that it will continue in Christian Weston Chandler's Adult Chronicles. Because that's just what we need, a spin-off. Sonichu issue 10. Despite the announcement at the end of the previous issue, Chris's character returns and immediately places himself in the middle of the spotlight. During the time this issue was being drawn, Chris was boiling with rage and crying for the blood of Jack Thaddeus, Clyde Cash, and every other troll for the straightening out of homosexual males due to all the gay ads in his Wikipedia. As such, whatever small narrative restraints Comic Chris had possessed had been extinguished, and the character acts purely as a mouthpiece and avenging fist for its creator. At the beginning of the comic, Chris discusses the future, wherein he is to be married to a woman named Lovely Weather, and since he slept with her, he is no longer a virgin. Apparently, homosexuality is such a big problem in the future that Chris was also sacked, or rather asked, by future scientists to donate some of his straight blood so that they could use it in a vaccine. Yeah, you're not. I'm not reading. This is not a typo, by the way. This was a real thing that happened in the comics. I don't think that vaccine's working. Chris, however, hoping to employ it on the homos in the present, sends Magi-chan back to the future to steal a crate of the vaccine. This is contrary to the time travel logic he established in Time Hogs, wherein it is assumed that time is in flux and cannot be altered. Again, Chris probably should have realized this, but what can you do? Do you think Chris ever thought anything about this outside his idiotic quest for vengeance? No, I didn't think so. Chris moves on to fight some devil trolls who had infested his old website, and then he attacks and destroys 4centgarbage.com, leaving 100 people dead in the process, including Jack Thaddeus and Clyde Cash, who are forced to commit suicide. Chris is then attacked by Nate Cirque, but Chris eventually gets the upper hand and tries out the gay vaccine on him. After Nate Cirque turns back into his old incarnation, Chris declares the vaccine a success and gives the order to pollute all the drinking water in the world with it, effectively eradicating homosexuality along with asexuality. Meg Griffin, of all people, suddenly turns up and claims to be a fan of Sonichu. Much to Chris's pleasure, after beating up some random guy who called Meg Sir and Chris Madam, he cheats on Lovely Weather by making out with her. After her confirming that she is consensual, unbeknownst to Chris, Meg is really Sylvana Rosechew in disguise, and Chris has therefore been trolled. Again, I'm going to take a hint that Lovely Weather has no issues with this. Also, Chris during his physical transformation. Note that Chris's redesign bears far less resemblance to how he looks now than the original design ever did. Uh-huh. More or less. Once again, Chris takes the time to apologize without really apologizing. It's like, I'm sorry you're mad kind of apologizing. That's the level of tact Chris thinks he can just put on. This time with a babbling, insincere speech to the homosexuals who might have been offended by the fact that he just committed something comparative to genocide against them. With that out of the way, and it really does come across as that out of the way, Chris takes out the Sonichu balls and transforms into Colossal Chan, and together with Sonichu, now transformed into Ultra Sonichu, sets out to right some wrongs. Aside from the minor detail of getting Crystal out of the mirror, Hobo Chan's main priority is getting rid of Asperchu, which he does by breaking into Aspercher/Alec Benson Leary's house, finger banging his Hexbox pavilion to the breaking point and turning Asperchu and the rest of the comic cast into improved versions of themselves. After this, Hobo Chan fights Merrily Walsh again, leaving her completely paralyzed and sentenced to a lifetime in Quickville's maximum security prison. Killing her is out of the question after the Liquid Chris farce. After that, Chris reverts to his human form and gives a speech. Meanwhile, Simona Rosechew is murdered, and the Asperpedia 4 are arrested for the crime. And at the same time as Chris starts giving out blessings and apologies to the Asperpedia 4, they are subjugated to a show trial for their crime against him and Quickville, and are then brutally executed by the Sonichus, with Chris partaking in Alex's execution by electrocution and personally carrying out Mal's execution by tearing him apart with his psychic powers. The huge issue finally concludes with Chris urging everyone to celebrate his masturbatory holiday, Christian Love Day, and leap and dance and sing praise in his name, for great is his wisdom and his benevolence. It truly is his story, and nothing less. Issue 11. Chris appears in Sonichu issue 11 near the end of A Sonichu Christmas, as having transitioned into a woman in the time since the last issue. Chris is only drawn on one page, appearing in photographs of the subsequent pages like in issue 6. As the episode takes place in 2008, Chris is depicted as becoming Christine much sooner than in real life. This is confusing, explained by retconning the time travel plot so that Magi-chan helped 2007 Chris to transition into a tomgirl in 2014, and then sent her back to 07/08. Or something. And by the way, this is the depiction in question, so let's just... Christopher Weston Chandler, you goddamn bastard. You of all the people in my entire life have royally destroyed and dishonored my own name. You reckless disrespect of women has ruined all of their lives on this earth. I can never, ever tolerate or even forgive your sorry as hell asshole. I am too beyond ashamed. I've never given you life and power in our Quickville. Christopher respects all women, or you can motherfucking burn in hell forever. So, this is ironic because this is sort of before the monster that Chris would become. But again, if you're like me and you can work out what the problems here are, is that it doesn't even call Chris on the fact that maybe the thing he needs to do is apologize for the things he's done in his past, and of course the things he would do in his future. That's like, this doesn't really solve or answer anything else, unfortunately, so there you are. It was a complete waste of time. Sonichu issue 12 marks the first time where Chris takes a major role in his new female form. He attended Quickville's first annual SLGBTQ along with his sister Crystal, the hedgehogs, and his self-spawned children. After initially convincing Rednark, he is still evil gay twin, to quit with a text wall, he would find himself battling Rednark in their respective Sonichu form, with Cole Smithy brainwashed to the Jerkop's cause. After sending his half-brother into a pocket dimension, Rednark and Chris would find themselves locked in a battle in yet another pocket dimension. Confusing? Not yet. After defeating Red Narc, revealed some of the Jerkops are zombies and wonders if his evil twin can ever be befriended. Chris would end the episode with a tribute to his late father and claiming he is the reincarnation of a lesbian hippie who attended Woodstock. What can you do? Sonichu issue 12-9. In this pony-laden issue, Comic Chris appears in the form of Christine Doll in Act 1. Chris also opts to insert his real-life self into the comic by means of using photographs, a technique that he has used in the webcomic before. Issue 13. This article is yet to be completed due to stress. Sonichu issue 13 sees the largest case of self-importance since Sonichu issue 10. You're not wrong. Focusing on how Chris became a goddess, Chris takes the role as the leader of Quickville in a war against the Nazis, and unsurprisingly pulls out a Deus Ex Machina to fix time-space or some shit. It's important to note that issue 13 was written under the direction of the Idea Guys, and as such should not be entirely interpreted as Chris's fantasies and warped view of the world. The comic is specifically orchestrated to bring misery to both the real-life and fictional Chris Chandlers, as exemplified in the scene in which Chris and Sonichu rape one another. So, as far as literally everything we needed to cover, that's technically everything, insofar as what we know of like how Chris depicts himself, and how unfortunately his attempts at portraying himself as anything other than creepy, badly drawn, and somebody with a lot of good intentions, but unfortunately through his actions, through his idiotic nature, through his awful actions against crimes against humanity that would make the likes of Pol Pot blush. We've also got to remember that he almost looks like Daniel Lawson in this one. It's also important to remember is that Chris's sad, warped view on reality is so warped and completely unlike anything else. We must also bear this in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that as bad as all this is, it's nothing compared to what Chris is like in real life. If anything, this is probably the person that maybe Chris probably aspired or wish he could probably be. Somebody who was loved, somebody who was respected, somebody who was appreciated. But as we know, that's not the case, because one important thing you've got to bear in mind, ladies and gentlemen, and this is something that I hope everybody watching this will probably take on and understand, is that you've got to earn people's respect. You've got to make so that people will actually respect you because you've actually contributed something to society, contributed something more to the world, not take things away. Because people are respectable to people who have good ideas, to people who give intellectual thoughts, to, other things like intellectual consideration. And no amount of bad artistry, bad writing, bad decision making, or crimes that are, to be honest, completely beyond measure. And that's not even talking about the things we know in the sub-episodes. This is just in the main series. It makes Chris, very sadly, possibly the single worst sort of comic book character to ever exist. Now, I could be wrong about that because there's probably maybe some other things that perhaps I'm sort of not going over in this. But if there should ever be another issue of Sonichu, I'm pretty sure Chris could find ways to making himself look even worse. Because, again, for those who are very familiar about Chris's online reputation, you know that it literally couldn't get any lower. But Chris somehow finds a way of making himself look worse and worse and worse at every single turn, at every opportunity you could give this man. Chris has not learned a single thing in 18 years, and it's possible, even by the standards of Chris, that he could learn even less, or he could learn the wrong things. In many ways, that's kind of who Chris is. He's someone who learned all the wrong things and choose to run with them, and is still somehow surprised about how his life has turned out the way it is. Sad, but very, very true. And with all that being said and done, I hope you guys have enjoyed this reading of Comic Book Chris, as he's depicted in his own comics, and I cannot wait to talk with you guys again in the next video. Take care, and bye-bye for now. Keep zapping, ladies and gentlemen, to the extreme.